Today we're going to wrap up evolution by talking about the mechanisms of evolution. Essentially explaining why evolution happens, why microevolution happens, and why macroevolution happens. So there's one thing to understand. If you flip to page 5 in your workbook, is the 5 fingers of evolution. So 5 different mechanisms, 5 different causes. Now the pinky finger, this is going to be genetic drift. So these are going to be different things that occur that make a population smaller, hence the small finger. The ring finger, typically put a wedding ring on your ring finger. So this is going to be non-random mating. So they choose their own mates. Middle finger is mutation. The pointer finger is gene flow. This is going to be dealing with immigration or emigration, so kind of pointing a direction. And then finally, your thumb is natural selection. Your thumb is completely different than the rest of the fingers on your hand. So we're going to talk about all 5 of those causes. Now regarding natural selection, we have 3 different types of natural selection. The first type is called stabilizing selection. This is where it is beneficial to be in intermediate form. So if we look at babies that are too heavy or too light are selected against. So what ends up happening is we see a greater number of babies in that intermediate range that are basically from like 5 to 8 pounds. So that intermediate range is favored. That is stabilizing. The middle. Directional. This is where we see a shift, where one extreme is favored over the others. We already talked about your moths during the Industrial Revolution and how the black moth was favored after the revolution compared to the white moth because it could blend in better. So we see a shift where it is now beneficial to be one color versus the other color, and in future generations we see a much greater percentage of black. So a shift toward one extreme versus the other. Directional. So this is a shift, either left or right on a graph. Disruptive. This is our final possibility, is we are favoring both extremes. If this is like incomplete or codominance, so incomplete dominance or codominance, we are favoring homozygous, and the heterozygous is selected against. So we are going against the kind of that intermediate, and instead we're selecting for the extremes. So disruptive. So 3 possibilities. Either we are selecting for the intermediate, or we're selecting for the 2 extremes, or we're simply shifting to one side versus the other. 3 types of natural selection. Gene flow. Gene flow deals with immigration or emigration. Genes coming in, genes leaving. Basically understanding what is in the gene pool, what is available to breed for future offspring. Mutation. Mutation brings in new alleles. So unpredictable changes in DNA. These have to occur in your sex cells. Remember, we call these your gametes. Sperm and egg. If it doesn't occur in your gametes, then it can't be passed on. And this is the only way for new alleles to be created. So new variations. And variations can become adaptations. So mutation is a driving force of evolution, creating new variation. Non-random mating. So selecting mates based off of location, because they're around. You're going to mate with something or someone that is within close proximity. Or phenotypes. We do have what's called sexual selection, where females will judge males based off of a mating ritual, or it could be size. In terms of like bigger bucks, may fend off smaller males and kind of get the doe's attention. So it could be a behavior thing. Dark brown beetles only mate with dark brown beetles. Isolation, there could be inbreeding among a population. But the key thing is, it's not random. It's basically who's in the area and then who's attracting attention. Genetic drift. This is when we are basically making a small population. Because changes happen faster in a small population versus a larger one. So we have two types of genetic drift situations. You have a founder effect. A founder effect is when a new population is established by a very small number from the larger ones. So this could be simply a migration. And we also have what's called the bottleneck effect, where this is usually going to be some type of natural disaster, a drastic reduction. So if you have a natural disaster occur, you have a population of survivors. And those survivors are going to determine what is in the following generations. So bottleneck is natural disaster, founder effect. And when you think of the founding fathers, a small group of people formed new colonies when it comes to setting up the colonial United States, or the basic original 13 colonies. So those original pioneers, the colonists, whatever genetics they brought over from England, that is what those colonies had. That's what they were limited to. Small populations. So how do species evolve? Well, the key thing is macroevolution. This is much larger scale. So we have everything happening in microevolution. So microevolution plus time gives us macroevolution. Remember, microevolution is simply just talking about a change in allele percentages. When you have change in allele percentages over time, this could lead to new species. So what is a species? Well, it is a group that can breed and produce fertile or viable offspring. They share the same gene pool. This is a big one right here. They must be able to produce fertile offspring. So same gene pool. If they produce infertile offspring, they are not the same species. Or if they can't reproduce at all with another organism, they are too genetically different. So whenever we isolate populations, this is when we lead to speciation. So the more gene flow you have, the more similar they are. But if gene flow stops and isolation occurs, small populations don't interbreed, this is when we end up with genetically different organisms, which could lead to different species. So we could have what's called reproductive isolation occur, where we no longer have interbreeding, and these small populations end up becoming so genetically different over time that they are no longer the same species. This could be from a look or even a behavior standpoint. So speciation. The key thing is one species becomes other species. So to create a new species, it has to become from a previous one. They don't just appear out of nowhere. You must stop the gene flow. So you must stop the interbreeding between two populations. And then the other mechanisms, natural selection, mutations, genetic drift, will take over, as well as non-random mating, will take over and cause changes. And when those changes become so large, and they don't reproduce amongst the populations, they will end up becoming two separate species. So if you stop interbreeding, all those differences will pick up over time. Now, we have three types of isolation. You have what's called behavior isolation, where this might be mating rituals, where if birds, for instance, don't follow the correct courtship or mating ritual, then they will not breed. Well, if the two populations became separate enough that their behavior changes, that will prevent one population from potentially breeding with the other, since the ritual might have been created over time. We have a geographic isolation. It's a pretty easy one. If you are separated by a river or a mountain, that's going to prevent you from interbreeding with the other population. So a physical or geographic barrier that isolates two groups that once was one population. Or temporal isolation. This deals with time. If it turns out that one population mates at a different time of the year, well, they're definitely not going to interbreed. So timing. So time is going to prevent populations if the whole mating happens at different parts. So behavior, physical separation from geographic barriers, or simply timing during their reproductive cycle. Now finally, we have patterns of macro. Now gradualism, this is just a slow, gradual process where we see small differences over long periods of time. Punctuated, the word punctuated means kind of abrupt. And this is where we see big changes. Like a big change right here, we see a separation between species, and then periods of essentially gradualism. Long periods of no change. So big change followed by very little. So in the fossil record, this would show maybe by a new species right away, and then nothing for a while. Whereas gradualism, these are going to be very, very slow changes over time. So gradualism, slow, punctuated, very big event, and then a period of not much of anything. So when you see this big separation here, that would be punctuated. You see a nice gradual line, gradualism. A combination of both of these appear in the fossil record. So just think of the name in terms of what they actually mean. Adaptive radiation. This is what happened with Darwin's finches, is instead of having one bird with kind of a do-it-all beak, they ended up becoming several birds that specialize in one type of food. They have a special niche or a role. They only go toward one type of food instead of several. Why this occurs? Well, more different species can live in one area. It decreases competition. And adaptive radiation typically occurs after mass extinction because less competition, it opens up new roles within the ecosystem. So you see changes to kind of fit that role within the ecosystem in terms of a predator-prey relationship. So instead of having a beak that kind of can do it all, they end up specializing in one type of prey for whatever that beak. So we see a lot of beak changes. The big, thick beak for maybe the harder nuts and seeds, the more pointier beaks for maybe some insects. Definitely different than what we see there. Okay, that is it for evolution. The mechanisms. Remember, we talked about the evidence. Now we talked about kind of what drives evolution. Why does it happen? If you have any questions, please ask. Thanks for watching.